Hi, folks. It's time for my yearly re-record. I'm going to try to do this a little bit more often because my supporters deserve to be thanked, and I want to keep things more up to date going forward. First off, thank you for returning to the Whiskey Ring. If this is your first time here, or if you're a frequent listener, please take the moment to like and subscribe, rate and review wherever you found the podcast. If you have suggestions for how to make the podcast better, or guests or topics you'd like to hear, please reach out to me at david@whiskeymyweddingring.com or via Facebook or Instagram. Second, I want to thank my vintage level sponsors, those at the highest level who keep this podcast going. Truly, without these supporters, I would have had to stop doing this a long time ago. Thank you specifically to Don, to John and Jim, Bill and Connor, Steve, Jake and Bill, Trevor, Michael and Jesse, Jared, Brendan and Larry, Logan, Patrick and Andrew, Dustin, Wade and Gavin, Daniel, and Justin. Thank you all for supporting, listening, telling your friends about this podcast. Cannot stress enough how much you all make this possible to go forward. If you haven't yet joined the Patreon, please consider doing so at patreon.com/whiskeymyweddingring. You can support for as little as $5 a month, where you can have access to ad-free episodes, and will also have priority if a vintage spot becomes available. Those spots are strictly limited, so if a spot becomes available, you're going to want to be the first to know. Lastly, going forward, I am trying to be better about posting show notes for each episode on my website, whiskeymyweddingring.com. These show notes will have links to websites and socials for my guests, and will also have additional information not in the interview, including reviews and tasting notes whenever possible or relevant. Thank you everyone for listening, and I hope to have you back as a listener next week. Hey folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast. Today I am talking to the northernmost distillery in the contiguous 48 states. We're up in Halleck, Minnesota with Far North Spirits. And to talk about Far North, got on Mike Swanson. Mike, welcome on.
How you doing? Good to hear.
Yeah. All right. So, like I said, northernmost distillery, and I'm pretty sure this is only the second Minnesota distillery I've spoken to. I got to Vikra a couple of years ago.
Okay.
So got to talk to them. So, but still, they're on the opposite side of the state from you. So, other than following you very shortly into the market, we're going to have a divergent conversation today. So, Mike, I first found out about you through multiple sources, really, two in particular. Lost Lantern, featuring Far North as a single cask, and I believe in at least one, if not two, of their blends. And also from Whiskey Acres, where they were like, you got to talk to this guy. We're talking about corn. He's the rye guy. And on Meet the Minnesota Makers last October, Sherry was saying, Sherry, your wife, Mike's wife, saying Mike has developed a nationwide reputation as the rye guy. That's where we're making our mark. We're changing the conversation about how whiskey is made. So I'm going to start off with saying, do you embrace that personality as like the rye guy?
Yeah, actually I do, because it's been years now. And when I started, I knew I was going to make rye whiskey, but I didn't know how much I was going to learn, and I didn't know how much was not known. I was walking into this just expecting everything to be a known quantity, and it really surprised me how much there still was to learn, and it was really invigorating to find out, hey, we got a lot of research to do, we got a lot we can do here, and that's been really fun to explore that.
So you've had a kind of divergent path to get to where you are, and in thinking about the research, you've got farming in the family. So you're fourth generation.
Yep.
Farm.
My great grandparents came here from Scandinavia back in the early 1900s.
Right. So the farm's been in the family hands since 1917. So you've got that angle, but you also left for a while to do first, bio and chem, go towards becoming a doctor, perhaps, then into marketing. As you said, there's a lot to learn and a lot to research about this. You've done some of the research. We'll get into that. Does this feel right, having come back to being farming and distilling?
Yeah. It's I feel like I use about everything I've learned since I was about 11 years old. Everything from the technical acumen, remembering farming techniques and things that my grandpa used to tell me and my dad used to tell me, to the bio and chem degree, to healthcare research, to business school. It's all been useful. It's been fun that way.
And in thinking about this too, I know that there are thousands of farmers across the U.S. for whom they've been multi-generational farmers, and there's not a hint of distilling or brewing in sight for excess grain and such. But for your family in particular, was there ever distillation, brewing, anything with excess grain that you might have had over the last century?
Not that I'm aware of, and I'm really doubtful that there was. For her part, my grandmother was an absolute teetotaler. And so that was the second generation here on the farm, but not to my knowledge. I mean, a lot of it went on in this area during Prohibition, mainly given how close we are to the Canadian border. There was a lot of bootlegging that was going on in this area, but there was a fair amount of moonshiners too. I've talked to a couple of historical societies, and there was a pretty big operation just east of Moorhead, about 150 miles south of here, and they were trying to figure out this based on the equipment that was listed in the arrest documents, to figure out what his capacity was. And it was bigger than mine. It was a good sized operation. And he was selling shine in paint thinner cans. And that's how they caught him, is these shipments of cans and to this east of Moorhead, and they couldn't figure out why in the world you'd need that many. And turns out, yeah, it's a moonshine operation. Fun to dig into stuff like that.
And no telling how well he cleaned out the paint thinner cans
Exactly right.
before putting in the moonshine. So in thinking about this too, and listening to the research for this episode, I heard when you were exploring your MBA, so this was more on the marketing side, and the business idea that came up during it, that becoming Far North Spirits eventually. During this period, the farm was in a season or two where the crop prices were really in the tank. And it reminded me, it was similar to a recent guest JT Mellick's story down in Louisiana about their idea to start distilling came about because they had a really terrible rice harvest, and they needed something to, what's the word I'm looking for, to diversify or to hedge them against a really bad harvest or something. Now, theirs was a bad crop versus yours could have been a good crop. The prices were just in the tank. Given those two things, does it ultimately end up being kind of the same idea that you're still trying to diversify and bring in funds to the farm whatever way you can?
Yeah, well, it just I mean, that was of course part of it. Was knowing how vulnerable you are in a commodities market to just where the price happens to be that year. And it moves around and it goes up and it goes down, and some years are a lot better than others, but it's all factors beyond your control. And so, the farm was fine, but I just thought this would be a really interesting way to vertically integrate something that we were growing on the farm. It was a vertical integration model that is actually has a lot of history behind it. This is what farmers used to do 300 years ago in the colonies. If you distilled part of your crop, you could use it like cash. You could use that whiskey like cash. It didn't spoil. It transported much easier. You only needed cash for so many things, and so you needed to go buy coffee and cloth and a few things like that. But farmers back then were pretty self-sufficient, and so it was a really really easy way to take your know-how and vertically integrate part of your crop. So they were doing this, hundreds of years ago in New England. And I thought, I think that model still kind of works. Because if you take you take a bushel of corn or a bushel of rye and turn it into whiskey, it's much more valuable than it is as a bushel of rye or a bushel of corn. And so it really still makes sense. It's a lot more complicated than that, given our 3-tier system and how that works.
Sure.
And distribution and things like that. It's quite a game now. And so it's not as simple as it used to be, but the concept still works. Acre per acre, revenue per acre, whatever you want to call it. But that model was what interested me when I was working on my MBA. What I didn't know at the time was that you can take grain and you can treat this more like an estate vintner, but because everybody just assumed it was a commodity, and it turns out it's not. And I didn't know that at the time. That's something you learn along the way, but it's been eye-opening to find out, like, this actually makes a big difference. And so you explore varieties and you explore agricultural techniques and things like that, and you go down rabbit holes that you didn't even know existed. And that's for me, the science geek part. That's the fun part. To learn all those things that you didn't even know existed.
And just to do one more thing on the MBA, did you make good on the professor's request to have the first case or sign you up for a case of the first batch?
Yeah, she got hooked out.
Good, good.
Yeah. I
So
actually she's the dean of the business school now, and so every other year or so I drop her an email, a reminder that this is still partially her fault.
here, I love that's a common phrasing or such from distillers. Like, it's not your idea, it's your fault. You did this.
Hey, anybody in the business knows what I mean.
Yeah, for sure. One of the another really interesting kind of influence, if you will, or inspiration that came up in the research was at one point you watched an Austrian skydiver's TED talk, and it was about him. Life's too short. Got to take risks. Got to do that. Now, I want to note that that skydiver later died during a skydiving incident, which I'm sorry to laugh about, but it's going to happen. So, at what point in the timeline of whether the NBA or creating Far North did that video kind of happen that inspired the life's too short not to do this?
Yeah. Well, here, the guy's name was Yuli Gagenschaft, and the video that I'd watched was set to one, the great M80 song. Two, he was in a wingsuit, and so he was literally flying. And I was a skydiver years ago. I've only made like 23 jumps, but I loved it. And so it really resonated with me. And he just talked about this fundamental human desire of wanting to fly. And it just really resonated with me. And that was when life is too short to spend making PowerPoint presentations for a living. And because that's what I was doing in marketing, basically. And it just didn't inspire me. And I thought, I don't want to spend the next 25 to 30 years of my life doing something that is not inspiring to me, not fulfilling, and so that at the same time, that really resonated. It just made me realize I wanted to make something with my hands again. And, I wanted to create something that I was going to be able to point to in 30 years and say, I did that. And that's what this has become.
So in the early days of Far North, and we're talking before it even got started, before we started distilling, really ideation phase. One of the influences, actually, I'm going to pause there for a second because I should have noted this. When I say northernmost distillery in the contiguous 48, Mike, you referred to how close you are to the Canadian border. You're 25 miles from the Canadian border, way up there, northwest corner of the state, closer to North Dakota than to most of the rest of Minnesota. Really way up there. And this feeds into the pursuit, if you will, of Dave Pickerel in let's say 2011, 2012. So it took you 6 months, to get him to answer the phone.
Yeah,
not surprising. He was known for taking a long time to get kind of in, and well, you know this, but taking a long time to get in. But once you got in, he'd answer your call.
Right.
So Dave guided, as you've talked about, many things. He guided talking about the rye and how you could really focus on this is a sense of place, if you will, and teaching you the basics of fermenting, how to distill. And because he had done with Whiskey Acres, you guys have the same still setup, the 500-gallon 8-plate Vendome still. So while Dave guided a lot of things on the production side in particular, did he also help you out when thinking about the branding and storytelling that went alongside it?
There was some of that. I'm going to take my glasses off and get in the window reflection here. There was some of that. I mean, when I first approached him, anybody who worked with Dave know that the guy's phone rang constant, and he would not feel the pressure to get back to every single phone call because they were just all day long. And so I chased him for about 6 months and I was like, all right, this guy's, I think I can take this as an answer. I'm going to give him one more shot. And it was the day after Christmas. And he picked up the phone. And so I introduced myself and I said, here's what I'm up to. And before I started, he said, I'm going to stop you right there. He said, tell me who you are and what you want to say. And so I said, look, I'm a farm kid who's done a lot of different things so far in life. So who is build a rye whiskey distillery on my family farm up by the Canadian border. I said, I want to grow my raws right outside the door. And I want to say that the farming matters. And the line was quiet for 10. If you tick that off, you realize how long that is. Mm-hmm. And so 10 seconds of silence. And he said, all right, keep talking. And so then we started a conversation. And it wasn't until he'd been here for the second time, we did our first ferments, we did our mashes, we did our first runs on the still. And he had said, well, here are some mash bills, that are common in the industry. And he said, start here. But he said, I got to tell you, he said, if you don't change these, I'm going to be really disappointed in you. Because he said, what you're going to learn is that he said, you're distilling just this one variety that you're growing. And he said, this is going to act different than the rye we were using down at Maker's Mark. And he said, because it's not a mix. And he said, I don't know anybody that's done any research into that, but he said, you're going to get a feel for how this acts in your distillery. Because he said, look, this is a whole different animal. I started off and I started distilling in Hadley. And I had picked it for winter hardiness, but it has this flavor profile. It's just kind of incredible. And I didn't know it was different at the time. I hadn't distilled anything else, so I didn't know. And that is what led to the entire rye research. It's what led to the place effect. It has what led to every rabbit hole I've gone down with this. That's how it all started.
In addition to Dave, there was one other influence that I picked up just over the thing. It was when you were on Bourbon Lens, you said that you liked the proofing process that Hubert at Germain Robin uses.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you follow that at all, or was it more like it works for him, it's great, but doesn't quite work for us?
I have tried to. It doesn't really work. It doesn't work for us, mainly because I'm just not as patient. And it's also, incidentally, this is why I don't call myself a master distiller, because I've met one. And after you meet a gentleman like Bear, you realize that's a master distiller. Okay, I'm still the new guy. He's forgotten more about making brandy than most people will ever know. And he's a genius, but he also happens to be just a really good guy. And so he's very pleasant to talk to, and he just knows so much. I mean, he grew up in Cognac and he's been making brandy for 40 some years now. I mean, the guy he's amazing.
So
really
in addition to,
and just an inspiring guy to listen to.
Yeah, I was telling, who was I telling recently? I can't remember. But of the four earliest distilleries here, it was Marco at Charbet. I was saying, of the four earliest distillers now, I've had three of them. Germain Robin remains the fourth on there, and I'll have the quartet of like 93 and prior distilleries in the U.S. So I'll have to see if I got a connection there too. But in addition to Dave, obviously, and Hubert, when you were thinking of this idea, it was very early on in the craft movement in the U.S. There was, only one distillery in Minnesota beat you to the punch, that being Panther. So not a lot of people that you could look to otherwise for guidance, inspiration. But who else did you either visit or talk to that influenced how Far North, I was afraid I was going to do that, how Far North eventually came to be?
When I first got the idea, 2009, and I read and researched for a little more than 2 years before I got to the point where I could, we got to the point where I could, quit my job and start planning this thing full time. And I read and researched as much as I could, but there's not a lot out there. I mean, there's, this industry are either consultants or, the knowledge is kept in-house. Nobody's publishing a how-to manual. At least they weren't at the time. And so I was thinking, well, okay, we must be looking at a master apprentice situation. And so I did see that a couple of distilleries were offering like week-long courses, and one of them was like Parallel in New Richmond, Wisconsin. That was Paul Werney. And then the other one was Cobalt in Chicago. And so Robert was teaching a class there. And both of those classes were excellent and learned a lot. But, I learned quite a bit from Dave, and then the rest of it is self-taught. You learn a lot as you go. And what I've told people is like, it's kind of like somebody describing to you how to swim, and then you get thrown off a boat in the middle of the ocean. You got to figure it out fast. And so you learn a lot. But, I started talking with Jamie at Whiskey Acres pretty early on because he had a question about a steam trap, and then we realized we were both we were both farmers and we had a similar sensibility about this. And so, we knew we shared an ethos. The farmers in this industry know each other pretty well. Most of us would fit at the same table at ACSA. It's a small group, but like Adam recognized this at Lost Lantern. That's where he came up with the idea for Farmers Fields. And there's four of us in that blend. And in addition to Whiskey Acres and us, there's Colby at Frey Ranch and David at Corbin Cash. And we all have different operations in a lot of ways, different soil, different crop rotation, different techniques and stuff. But, we still share that ethos. And what we're kind of saying the same thing in many different ways is that the agricultural aspect of making whiskey is of vital importance. And it just makes a big difference in the end product.
So I don't know if we'll have time to get into the sustainability aspect of what you're doing, but in the guest post on Lost Lantern's website for, I believe it was when either Farmer's Field came out or when your first single barrel came out with them, you wrote that, you want people to love your whiskey, not because it's sustainable, but because it's better. And that you firmly believe that it's better because it's sustainable, that it's made with skill and passion in a place that is beautiful. You've got a very unique ecosystem there and biosphere there. You mentioned Colby and Ashley down at Frey Ranch. They're going to be different Whiskey Acres, and David out in California for Corbin Cash. These are even amongst themselves, they would be very different. But you have the added, I don't know if it's a complication, but added difference of having these alkaline soils. So I know this might be a little, well, maybe not hard to answer because you're a farmer and you know this and you've been doing this for a while, but have you found that the alkaline soils in particular have an impact on how the grain functions, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, and it's as black as my shirt, which is kind of a rarity in the Red River Valley. It's an ancient lake bed. Lake Agassiz was here about 15,000 years ago. And so we have, a couple 100,000 years of lake deposits in this valley. Soil is coal black and it's a lot of clay and it's heavy and it's alkaline. There's only a few places on the planet that have it. There's a black dirt region. I'm trying to remember where that is, somewhere in the States. There's the Nile Valley and there's Ukraine. And so there's not very many places that have this. But what we find is that, the yield and everything on the grain here is limited by the weather. We have a short growing season, and it's a harsh climate. But the quality of the grain is excellent. And what I'm starting to find, and we're starting to research, is rye I'm growing here is producing, regardless of variety, is producing higher levels of flavor compounds than the same variety grown somewhere else. And that this is preliminary. And so that's the hypothesis, is we're starting to see that this is possibly a thing. We just don't study it further because we know that different varieties produce different levels of flavor compounds. We've proven that and produce different flavors. But what we're finding here is that, is it a factor of soil composition? Is it a factor of rotation? Is it a factor of ecosystem? Is it climate? Is it rainfall? Is it growing degree days? There's a lot of variables to studying place. And so we're looking at this, but it's going to be a while. It's a lot to study. It's a lot to pick apart. But
Sure.
if you introduce this concept to somebody who grows grapes, they kind of look at you like you guys just figured this out. We've known this for 300 years. You guys are late to the party here. But we take a lot of inspiration from the wine world, estate wine vendors and grape growers. So they've got a lot to teach.
And I do want to just ask about the wording here, because I know you have openly shied away from the use of the word terroir. Like, you'll recognize it as, okay, it could fit, but it doesn't quite fit though. So for you, and particularly with Far North's products and what you're studying, can you just give a synopsis of why you feel terroir either doesn't encompass or doesn't quite fit what you're working with?
Well, I just think the traditional use of that word, it's a very French wine concept of everything in the vicinity contributes to the flavor of the wine. But typically that was, as I understand it, historically, that was meant to assume that you were doing a natural fermentation. And so you have a local yeast strain in addition to everything else that goes into the wine. And so there's a factor of non-manipulation. It's kind of implied in the concept. And we do a lot of manipulating. I mean, we're using a commercial yeast strain, we're distilling, we're barrel aging, we're doing all these things. But so I hesitate to use the word because I think it's very applicable to wine. but I think we need a better word for whiskey. And I don't know what that word is yet. There's some distillers that have used provenance as, as a workable term. I wish Shakespeare could be introduced to this concept. He'd probably come up with it, with his command of the English language. But I think we need a word that talks about place, whiskey's home in a way that is, I don't know if you can, in English, I don't know if you can sum it up in one, but I like the word home, and I think as craft distillers, this idea of you're producing not just a regional style, but a style from a specific place. And there's something to me that really resonates about that. And I think it's one of the better things the craft movement can offer the marketplace are these regional and place specific products. I think they're important. We've had way too much sameness and homogenation over the years. And I think expressing this is important.
I mean, I agree with you. I think we may end up needing one of those really complex German compound words that translates to something that it doesn't even mean. So maybe we'll need that. But yeah, I find myself, I usually default to like a sense of place. Dave Broom's definition of that being, like you said, there's the manipulations, there's the people, there's the cultures that are around it. And I think that's a good segue into where you are in Minnesota, in the upper north. You, and I believe Sherry too, you both have Scandinavian roots. So you said earlier your family came over 1917. So on the things like packaging and messaging and bottling, you have Scandinavian inspired, names, Ragnar, Solveig, these beautiful names under the House of Brands approach. And I'm mentioning that only if we don't get a chance to go to it, but there's also help me with the pronunciation of this word. It's the Danish word Hygge.
Hygge.
Hygge. Okay. So comfort, contentedness, sense of home. Yeah. So maybe we need hygge for whiskey.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good word. There's some good Scandinavian words as well. They're not romantic languages, however, and so they're pretty to the point. But there are some.
German's not romantic either, but
there are some really good concepts though. And there's half of my family came from Norway, the other half from Sweden. Elvis Sherry, Swedish and Danish and some German as well. And so, with our brand aesthetic, we were looking for like a modern Scandinavian or mid-century modern kind of style. It's really our preferred design sense as well. And so it just kind of works. But with the names, yeah, we did a house of brands approach rather than the umbrella brand.
I like it. The Scandinavian traditions as well. And I wanted to link this back to the beginnings of the ideas. In the late aughts and early, you said the idea first came to you in 2009. You're building out, start production and building in 2013. So there's a 4 to 5 year window there. This is also when Scandinavian, particularly Nordic, those are reversed, I guess. So Nordic being the broader term, Nordic cuisine and mindset becoming bigger in the world. Like Noma in Copenhagen was just taking the world by storm, everything being the foraging and real sense of place. And I think they use terroir as well, but all the different variations of the phrase were all just front and center at the time. As were, as you said, this idea of modern Scandinavian, clean, fine lines, not a lot of overcluttering. And did the kind of parallel movement of the Nordic food scene influence you in any way? Or was it just two parallel movements that happened to work in the same manifestation?
No, it absolutely inspired us, especially Noma. I mean, we used to, we would study how their dining room looked. Someday we wanted to model our cocktail room, and take some of those design elements and use in our cocktail room. And so that was hugely inspirational. Yes.
Love it. So, like I said, the only other Minnesota distillery I've gotten to so far is Vikra, and they are also leaning very much into their Scandinavian heritage. Emily was a wonderful guest there. We talked about gins and aquavits. But again, on the opposite side of the state. So talking about Northwest Minnesota and Halleck in particular, you've said the early reception to you coming back, you and Sherry coming back, was great. I mean, the town, the neighbors are all really supportive because it was kind of unusual for someone to come back and start a business.
Yeah, that wasn't the model. Most of the high school graduates left, and they left to go to college, but very few of them came back. There was a conduit from the colleges in Moorhead right down to the Twin Cities. That was the model, and I did leave for quite some time. I left for college in 1990, and I didn't come back until 2013. So I was gone a while. But but that was, people were very, very supportive because it was a very different concept. It was curiosity, but yeah, very, very supportive in the area for sure.
The times that you've spoken about of how quickly you got things like licenses and zoning approvals and all this is mind blowing.
Yeah, I think it was 90 minutes it took to get township board approval for our cocktail room light.
Right. You just needed to have one guy call another guy who was like, yeah, we'll stamp off on this and all good.
Literally what happened. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, you've said in the case of a community that's so rooted, no pun intended, in farming, there really is either you inherit a farm or continue working on the farm, or you find another position, you find another job, and that leads to a lot of people leaving. We've been talking more coincidentally than anything else to a bunch of distilleries around the world that are facing similar problems, either an aging population or people growing up, not a lot of job opportunities. They leave, they don't come back. And so the economy of the area just starts either failing or becomes a monoculture. In the 12, going on 13 years now that you've been in operation, have you felt like through Far North you've been able to drive some either economic change or even just give people an example of, hey, you can come back and start a business here and there's viable opportunities? You just got to think outside the box.
I've heard from people, and not in this area, but in similar types of areas where they've said they've taken some inspiration from what we've done, because when you're in a small area like this, there's nobody tells you no. Like, if you want to come back and start a business, they're going to be very amenable to that. And so you're not facing like a neighborhood association backlash. It just doesn't. You're going to get your license, you're going to get your permits. It's going to happen because they just like the idea of any kind of business coming back to the area. In Northwest Minnesota, what happened over the course of about 30 years is that the farms got progressively larger. The acres that one farming operation would farm dramatically increased, and then with the technology in the equipment and in the systems, it took fewer people to run the farm. So there you see your population decline. There you can run a 7,000 acre operation with with 4 guys, and it's really kind of surprising just how much you can get done with how few people. That was not even conceivable 70 years ago, that you could run a 7,000 acre farm with just 4 people, but it's commonly done up here. They used to take a staff of at least 20 to run that kind of.
Crazy. I know we could definitely talk more about that. I want to for sure, but I want to make sure to give due time to the products and the rye and especially the maturation as well. So I'm going to refrain from asking too much directly about the original rye study that you did. I will link the report to the show notes so people can read the report, mainly just because I know you've been asked about it a lot and it's been a couple of years since the results came out. So I don't want to retread too much there, but a couple of things did come out and I'm thinking about this in the context of the new studies that you're doing. In the original study that you did, this was in partnership with the Minnesota Extension, University of Minnesota, State University.
Yep.
Extension.
And yep. And it was funded by the Minnesota Department.
Right. So tried 15 different varieties of rye, each got 1 acre plots. They were, you tried to reduce as many variables as possible. They all got distilled in the same way, same yeasts, all of that. And the initial analysis was done before they hit the barrel, so no wood. There was more done after that to see, because you wanted to see how some of them, how they would age. And those results were surprising too, because you had a couple that you thought were garbage after if I can use that word, after the distillation, and worked really well in barreling, and vice versa. Ones that came off really great as white spirits and were kind of meh after the barrel. But with the initial study, you've said that you could have done a study, or you could have done the analysis using gas chromatography or GCMS machines, but you wanted to do the human sensory analysis instead, because this was a potable product that ideally would be drunk. So you focus instead on around 200 people, all different sectors that gave you the sensory analysis. With that initial study, did you ever also follow up with GCMS just to be sure, or did you leave it at the human sensory analysis?
The idea was how to deal with the problem of flavor being inherently subjective. And so you can measure flavor compounds, but it's people's interpretation of those compounds that is the entire business. It's the entire industry. And so if you have 100 people in the room and you ask them what cilantro tastes like, it's all the same compound, but somebody in that room is going to tell you it tastes like soap. And so it's just a different interpretation of the exact same compound. And so I thought, okay, let's do large sample size and see if we can see some meaningful differences pop in the data based on a very standardized questionnaire. And it did. But since that time, I've since seen data from a lab at Michigan State where they've measured specific flavor compounds in the ferment. And it's there that you see the differences really pop between varieties as well. And it kind of proves in the lab what we asserted based on sensory surveys. And it lines up. And so we're encouraged by that. The place study is the complicated one. That's really the tricky part. The thing with the barrel aging that was interesting was, my hypothesis is that the barrel aging was going to kind of smooth over or smooth out any differences in the data that we were seeing between varieties. And I really thought the barrel aging would take over that, and you would get whiskeys that really weren't that different from each other after barrel aging. And boy, it's exactly the opposite. It amplifies every difference. It's really quite surprising. And like you alluded to, I mean, there was a few varieties that I just didn't care for coming off the still at all, and they came out barrel and they had gone through this transformation that made them just incredible. And so it's been fun to explore that too, and to find how some of the compounds that were in the white whiskey, how they kind of meld and dance with the flavor compounds coming from the wood, and it's quite a process. It's always fun to explore.
And it's worth noting too the importance of the human sensory. Like you said, this is what people are actually going to drink, and the machines can measure concentrations of the compounds, the flavor compounds, but there's always going to be stuff that the human palate will note that maybe the computer doesn't, or the computer might note that something is there, but we're not going to pick up on it because it's too low a concentration, or it's just something that this one person doesn't pick up on. So with the current study that you're doing, you said you've seen the lab data from from Michigan State. Are you also using the labs to analyze it as you're going on with the study? Okay.
She has been studying corn varieties as well, and has some really interesting data on kind of similar findings to what we found with rye, is that there are significant flavor differences between varieties of corn. And there's a few heirlooms that produced the highest scores for pleasantness in her research, and one of them is Minnesota 13, the old heirloom, old U of M variety, and the other is Wapsie Valley, which I believe is Iowa, and they really stood out. And so it's interesting that she's finding similar things. They're not exact, of course, but so we're finding not just with rye, but with a completely different species like corn, you have varietal significance. And but with studying place, how are we going to do this? We're going to need 10 years and $15 million to study this. And so we're trying to figure out how to do it. We know it's significant. We know there's some there.
Think of because I had talked to someone who was using Wapsie Valley, and I was like, that was a while ago. It was Wiggle Whiskey in Pittsburgh. He was using Wapsie Valley corn. Not a lot of other, just I think Widow Jane uses a little bit of it, not a ton, but they're also bringing it in, so slightly different. Anyway, in the other question I had with the original rye study, you did find 3 or 4, I think, that you felt really kind of worked overall. They were enjoyable, and you were able to scale them. So the Hazlitt that you were already using, the AC Hazlitt, worked great. Musketeer being another one. And was Rosen included in the original study, or did that come later?
Rosen one, that came later.
Okay.
The varieties that I've laid down so far have been Hazlitt, of course. We've been growing that since 2012. We've laid down Musketeer, we've laid down Oakland and Spooner. And I'd like to work with Danko. Rosen came about, I met Laura Fields at the Delaware Fields Foundation out in Philadelphia, and she was working with Rosen, and I had never grown an heirloom at that point. I hadn't grown an heirloom yet. And so I got a sort of seed. It was a low yielder up here, but we just bottled it last week. And but it wasn't part of the original deal. In the original study, the way we the way we basically wrote we wanted to demonstrate significance to Minnesota farmers, and so they had to be varieties that would produce um, that would be viable for a Minnesota farmer to produce, which meant they had to have at least decent yield. And so we eliminated the heirlooms from the conversation at that point. But it's fun to it's fun to take a look at them for sure.
I'm thinking, as you mentioned, Danko as well. That's grown quite a bit of Danko grown in what I would call upstate or Western New York, and there's a band across kind of the southern half of New York called the Southern Tier. There's a distillery there called Black Dirt Distillery. A lot of New York distilleries got their distilling start there, and it truly is like you go through the backfields and the roads to get there, and it, like you were describing your soil, it looks black as coal. Cannot speak.
I'm just remembering now. Yes, it's in New York, and I was told about it just a couple weeks ago. When I was up in Fishkill for a whiskey event that Boutique put on. This lady was talking about the gardening that's done in this region and the black dirt, and how there were a lot of Polish immigrants in that immediate area. And so the fact that Danko kind of
right. So I can't speak to the alkalinity of the soil. I do not know the region that well. I'm a Long Islander, so anything above like 2 counties up is upstate to us. It's a very bad stereotype, but it is true. Again, as you mentioned earlier, the Nile Valley, Ukraine, these are places where for thousands of years they've been known as breadbaskets of empires because of the quantity and the yields that they can provide. So one of the ones from the original study that surprised me most, I think, was the Oakland. So this is a grain grown, originally designed, I guess, for Oklahoma, that worked quite well for you. I mean, it's currently for sale as a single varietal. Whereas the others, the Hazlitt, the Musketeer, those are known to be able to grow in the north as well. But Copeland did not work up there. A couple of others really didn't work because they were either too tall or too heavy-headed and would fall over. But the Oakland seems to have come through.
Yeah, and it was tall. It wasn't the first year I grew it. It wasn't a huge yielder. It was tall and it laid down in the thunderstorms, and so we had some lodging. But 2 years ago, when I grew it, 2024 was an exceptional year for rye. The weather pattern was just perfect that year. And so the Oakland was about up to here on me. It was over 5 feet tall, and it yielded about 50 bushels per acre, which for Oakland I thought was significant. That same year, my Hazlitt yielded about 90. And my average for Hazlitt has usually been around 60. And so it was just this exceptional yield year for rye. And so the Oakland did really well. We laid down quite a bit of it that winter. I found it a successful year for it. But when I first poured the seed days, one of the things that when I was asking about, inquiring about seed, the gentleman I spoke with on the phone could see that I was calling from Minnesota. I could tell he was being very diplomatic, but he thought he was dealing with an idiot. He was like, this was bred to be grown about 1,000 miles. And he said, your growing season's pretty short up there, isn't it? And I said, well, here's what I'm doing with it. And then he was on board. He was like, cool. But said, y'all send me a bottle of that stuff from the bedding, But it is. It was bred to be grown in a different environment.
Yeah, you have this will go into the maturation and production, but I was surprised to hear in your words how inconsistent the weather patterns are for you year over year. I guess I've said before on this podcast, I'm pretty naive when it comes to farming techniques, but I kind of assume certain areas have a fairly consistent pattern year over year. But as you said, you had a great year in 2024 for rye. Sometimes you got a lot of thunderstorms and extra wind. Sometimes it's super dry. It seems like, and correct me if I'm interpreting this wrong, but it seems like from the way you've spoken about it, that you have more of a variation than is typical for a region.
I mean, I don't know as much about, about other regions, but what I do know that is consistent here is the volatility.
Right.
You can count on that. What we don't have is the same kind of summer every year. We just don't. There's a lot of variability. And so there are some broad predictable patterns. We usually see our last frost in this window. We usually see our first frost in this window. It's typically wetter in June and drier in July and August, but it's all over the place. We've been here 12 years, and we've seen drought years and wet years, and we've seen wicked thunderstorms, and we've seen hardly any, and it's just kind of all over the place. We've seen very cold winters, we've seen mild winters. The weather patterns are volatile, and that was one of the conversations that I actually had with Dave early on. Was he said, this is going to be a great place to age rye whiskey because you've got all this temperature fluctuation, you've got humidity fluctuation. He's like, your angel share is going to be really balanced in its composition. And he's like, and he was like, with bourbon, we've always thought we needed to cook the barrel. But he said with rye, he said, I think he was just kind of, he was like, I think volatility is more important with rye. It gives you better balance, character. So he said, look, there's a reason to make Crown 3 hours north of you, up in Gimli, Manitoba. He said, I think it's going to be pretty cool to see the different kind of aging you're going to get here, and as opposed to, a hotter part of the country. And that has proven out. We have seen a huge amount of variation. And I think because of it, somebody like as astute as Adam has picked up on cold weather aging and Midwest production as being significantly different than other parts of the country, mainly like Kentucky and Tennessee and Indiana. He's picked up on that. There are significant differences in production, and one of the things is cold weather aging. And because we're talking about small distilleries, we don't have massive rick houses, where they have microclimates inside the rick. And so, we have 130-degree differences most years between January and August. And then we're seeing humidity from 25 to 95%, and sometimes it's in as little as 36 hours. And so it really puts the barrels through a workout. And like I was saying earlier, I think that's significant just because it's a significant difference in production and in place, and it results in different liquid, which to whiskey enthusiasts, like, that's what everybody wants. That's the ball game. Is if we were trying to mimic Kentucky and Northwest Minnesota, talk about a fool's errand that would be. They do a good job down there. Trying to mimic those guys, that seems kind of foolish to me. I'd rather express this place as best I can.
I think as of this recording, the previous episode that will come out is with Alex and Amy at Fort Hamilton Distillery based in Brooklyn. And they're also trying to come up with, no, not trying, they have come up with this New York style rye, evoking an older style closer to when, late 19th century, early 20th century, when cocktails were really growing, and what kind of rye they would have had at the Revolution. They said something during the episode that I don't think I got to address, which fits here, which is that they're in 7 states. Mainly New York is the biggest one, but Kentucky is a huge market for them. And they said, part of it was from bourbon fatigue and that, but it's also like, yeah, because people in Kentucky, I hope I'm not overstepping my boundaries by saying so, because I know a lot of people in Kentucky. In Kentucky and Tennessee, they've had the same producers for so long. Granted, some have branched out a bit, but there's a certain flavor that we've come to expect there. And even the people who live there that might love those brands, they started saying, okay, this is great, but what else is out there? And so seeing the penetration into Kentucky of brands like Fort Hamilton, like Far North, and all the brands that are coming in from around the country, let alone internationally, is great to see, because it's showing that even at the heart of bourbon production in the States, just by percentage, let's put it that way, there's still this interest in what does rye taste like, what a different rye tastes like. Not Kentucky style, not Maryland style, but Pennsylvania, Central, North. So in that vein, I also wanted to ask you, I feel like a generation of drinkers, MGP defined what rye tasted like. And in an earlier interview, Sherry was very optimistic that people at MGP would read the report, look at the study you guys had done, and take something from it. Then in a subsequent interview a couple years later, said that MGP had talked to you about the study. Now, I know as of this recording, they've paused production. There's a whole thing with that. But without breaking any NDAs, of course, are you able to just share what that kind of conversation was like what they would talk about? Interesting.
Guys at MGP, and they wanted to look at they wanted to just pick my brain about a specific problem they were having. And what they were basically looking for samples of open pollinated rye so that they could compare them to the hybrid varieties and the mix that they were getting when they sourced. Because they source, of course, huge amounts, and so you can't source that from one farm. The sheer number of bushels is too much. Um, and so you're getting. I'm going to back up just a second. When grain gets harvested, the varietal information is lost step one in the grain trade process. So when you're pulling the grain off the fields, going into a truck, the truck is going to a grain processing facility we call an elevator. Once it goes to that facility, wheat goes into the wheat bin, rye goes into the rye bin, barley goes into the barley bin. The varietal, it's a mix then, because you have different crops from different farms, and they're usually growing different varieties. They're not separating them by variety. It's a commodity at that point. So now your varietal information is gone. So for most of the large scale facilities where they're going, there's 10 to 15 truckloads coming in every morning, there's no way to separate that out by variety. And so it's going to be a mix just by the very nature of the grain trade. And so they were analyzing the mix that they were getting. At the time, it was coming from Sweden, but it was a mix of hybrids. And what we found out in some of the studies that were conducted at Michigan State is that the hybrids produce lower levels of the flavor compounds we were looking at than the open pollinated varieties. And we don't know exactly why that is yet, but they're bred under very different conditions. A hybrid is a hybrid. An open pollinated variety is, you can save the seed from it and it'll produce, the next generation will be almost genetically identical to the previous, with some exceptions, but that's generally how it works. And so there's the hybrids are more homogeneous in the field. You can see it in the height, you can see it in the stalks, you can see it in the grain itself, more uniform, and they yield considerably more, like double what most open pollinated varieties produce. So farmers have moved to them because it's more economical. It makes more sense to them. More profitable. And so if you're going to source a huge amount of rye, chances are it's probably going to come in, at least in part, it's going to be hybrids. But what we were finding and what they were finding is that it was affecting the flavor of their whiskey because not only hybrids produce lower levels of flavor compounds, but what I've found here at the distillery is when you start mixing varieties together, it muddies the flavor. And so you lose some of the nuance and character of an individual variety when you mix them together. The same thing happens with table wine, right? Table wine isn't bad. It can be really good, but it's never going to be as nuanced as like a Howell Mountain Cabernet or a Chambolle Musigny. It's just never going to have that level of nuance and character. And with corn and rye varieties, we're finding a similar thing. Is that if you mix Hazlitt, Musketeer, Oakland, Wheeler, a hybrid, and Brissetto together, you don't get any of those. You get a rye whiskey, but it's not going to taste like any of those varieties. It muddies it together. And so that's the situation they found themselves in is mixing hybrids together gives you what everybody knows as MGP rye or did, but they were seeing the flavor shrink a bit. And so they were looking at this like, is it possible to source large amounts of an open pollinated variety at an economic, and it's a difficult concept because just the sheer volume means that if you're going to convince that many farmers to grow Hazlitt, now you're competing with the corn and soybean rotation in most places, which is much more profitable. And so you have to pay more for the rye. You basically have to pay the farmer more to get those acres. And so it becomes a study in economics. It's an economic challenge in our testing.
And especially, I'm thinking too, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that most rye, even the rye that a massive producer like MGP is importing, is not specifically grown for whiskey making. So it's still going to be grown and bred for and optimized for protein content, for yield, and for spirits making, not even just whiskey, but spirits making, you're looking for more of the sugar to be in there as opposed to a lower protein content. So you're having the yields at every stage, and you're already starting with this mix of hybrids that are probably pretty high in protein, because they've become non-varietal specific, NVS or varietal non-specific. So yeah, to me, it just seems like a perfect storm of losing all of it. And I like your term of muddying the waters, muddying the flavors so that nothing stands out. For you, back to Minnesota specific, being from Minnesota, being in Minnesota has been clearly a driving factor for many decisions in production. So part of it being the rye that you're using grows well there. It's known to grow well there, but it goes beyond that. It's also the barrels that you're using. You're allowing for open top fermentation. You've got two yeasts. You've got the Lallemand XP for driving the yield, but you allow for the open top to add in local flora. So really, as far as I can tell, everything is Minnesota except maybe the glass and the packaging.
Yeah.
And one of the, I guess the aspect that popped out to me most was about the barrels. So the Minnesota oak, we've heard other producers not in Minnesota, not even in your region, say they like using Minnesota oak because you've got a really tight grain as opposed to, let's say, Appalachia or, oh my goodness, what area am I thinking of? Probably Appalachia, but also, southern area.
You're thinking the Ozark?
Ozarks, thank you. I was thinking Ozark, yes. And where it's just warmer, you don't have the same extreme temperature swings. So you got a tighter grain in Minnesota oak because of the long winters. But as you've described it in terms of barrel aging spirits, you've also got leaky barrels for the same reason, because of those extreme temperature swings. And you mentioned that Dave predicted you'd have a pretty balanced angel share. You've quoted it between 5 to 10% per year, which at least to me seems excessively high for where you are. Like I would expect, granted, you've said you got a lot of variation, but 5 to 10 feels like a lot, especially I think because you've got the 6 months where it doesn't go above freezing. A lot of time for oxidation rather than wood interaction. So what's going on in those barrels?
Well, what we're finding too, and to add to what I've said previously, is on our 53 gallon format, which we've been doing exclusively now for just over 2 years. Because when I started, I was using 15 gallon barrels, and that was a just under 2 year aging process, and we were seeing between 5 to 10% angel share on those. What we are seeing for the 53s is per year is under 5.
All right. That seems a little more realistic for what I was expecting.
It's a little more, and thank God.
Yeah.
But we're seeing less on those. The thing with the Minnesota oaks is, the trees grow slower because of the climate. But, when I've talked with Heidi at Black Swan, so what she said is, what we find is when the oak trees are further north in the state, they tend to produce higher levels of vanillin, and the level of vanillin in the wood is a little bit higher. And so they're a little bit sweeter. And we don't know exactly why. It's probably 60 years of variation with the variables when you're growing a tree as opposed to, growing a rye plant. So the variability really, really comes up. There's a tremendous oak, and so there's a lot to express there. But the wood's fantastic, and there's a lot of ways, a lot of things you can measure with the wood sugars and the vanillins and stuff like that. But it is a tighter grain, but it's also significant flavor.
I almost imagine it as the trees knowing they need to concentrate the sugars and hold on to more of them because it's going to be a shorter summer, shorter growing season for them. So maybe that leads into it. I'm not a dendrologist or by any means, but that just seems to be, from what I've heard of other oaks growing in either Ozarks, Appalachia, or even in Europe, that seems to kind of be the story. If it's a tighter grain and colder, it's going to concentrate more. And that's why you can get like maple syrup from the north. You don't really find maple or those kinds of trees in south of a certain area or a certain line. Knowing we've got, are you okay to go a couple minutes over time?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So I've got a couple more questions for you. So like I said, we've got the Lallemand yeast. We mentioned the 500 gallon pot still. You said you've been exclusively doing 53s for the last 2 years or so. And you at a certain point you're using 15s, 25s, and 53s as late as October 23 or so. You're producing about 125 53 gallon barrels worth of rye per year. Sounds about right?
Yeah. There's some split on that number. There's some split between rye and bourbon and single variety.
Gotcha.
So our production is small.
With the 500 gallon, this is a question I asked Nick as well at Whiskey Acres. How full are you charging the 500 gallons when you're doing either a wash or a spirit run?
Mm-hmm. Well, our batch size is 500 gallons, so we're going to put 500 gallons of wash in the still. But the capacity of the still is, right up to the lip of the manhole. It's probably closer to 650. There's some room in there. But when we charge it for a spirit run, so we're loading it up with low lines, we're probably still around 500, maybe a little bit more. It might be 575 with low lines. So, but it's typical.
The additional, well, what was the moment when you decided that you were going to go exclusively with the 53s?
Well, I think it was, years ago, because we didn't do the model where we were sourcing whiskey from anybody else. And so, we weren't sitting on a lot of cash. So we were really trying to make the most of our barrel budget. And so we're using 15-gallon barrel. We're turning those in less than 2 years. Per gallon of cooperage 15s are more expensive. And so we weren't left with much barrel budget for 53. That said, when we cracked those barrels after 4 and 5 years, I mean, it was difference in flavor is significant. And when I looked at the cost per gallon of cooperage, then it was like we got to move over to these. It just took time to do it.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So I wanted to give a little bit of time at the end to some of the other products that you're producing. This is going to include the white spirits, but also your finished products. So in the whiskeys, you've got your core Rocknar rye.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the 80-10-10.
That's the 80-10-10.
And then, as I mentioned earlier, with the Oakland, you've also got Musketeer out right now, I believe, with single varietal at 95.5. And that's 95 rye, 5% malted rye.
Yes,
Right?
of
Yeah.
that same variety.
Of that same variety.
Musketeer is going to be 95 Musketeer, 5 Musketeer malt. And same with the Oakland, 95 Oakland, 5 Oakland malt. And Hazlitt is 95 Hazlitt, 5 Hazlitt. So on.
Beautiful. Love it. And this spring, so you've got a couple of new releases coming out too, which is, I saw the label for the Rosen came out. So that'll be later this year. And the Bottled and Bond Musketeer should be coming out in the spring as well, right?
Yep. Probably close to June.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So with these additionals, sorry, I've got to ask, are there any bottles left of the Maryland style you used to make?
I do. I actually have some 5-year Maryland here at the distillery.
All right. You were on a show back in just January, just last month of this year, and they were asking if there was any of that left. And I know it's not what you do anymore, but it's one of those things that like I got to taste it if I can because it's unique, So you've also just mentioned an interest in finishing casks, and you've done finish. You use cognac cask as part of the process for the Rocknar rye, and that's kind of the only the only non-Minnesota part of the product.
Yes.
I know your overall distribution, you said actually isn't too bad considering that you're so far north because you're close enough to the interstates that it's maybe adds a day in total. It's not like adding days and days upon travel, but you are still 6 hours from the Twin Cities, 5 from Duluth. I'd imagine getting things in, like finishing casks in that you want to use, sometimes poses a challenge. So when you decide that you want to use a cask type or varietal, how long does it take you to get one? And do you have to manage dry casks that might come in?
Yeah, well, it depends on the type. I mean, cognac was a little more readily available, and so I was able to source those from a barrel broker in Denver, and that was pretty straightforward. And we've used cognac now ever since we launched Rockner, and we always finish Rockner in cognac. But I wanted to play with Sauterne, and I had to wait for almost 3 years for those barrels. They weren't as easy to come by back then. I PX sherry as well as Madeira, and in the early days, I did some a little bit of cask finishing in Oloroso. So there's been a little bit of that.
And so not too bad to get them in. And I'm not saying you're doing hundreds of barrels.
The barrel brokers are really good at what they do, and so they're able to get these. When they're putting together a shipping container in Europe, they're giving everybody a heads up. So if you want to grab a couple of casks, you can, and you may only have to wait a month or so to get a hold of those.
Bad.
Yeah.
What of the finishes that you've tried so far, what do you think has worked best with, I was going to say with specifically Hazlitt, but what do you think has been the best pairing of a rye you've made and a finishing cask?
We have to do it as a limited release because the availability of the casks is rarer. But that said, I mean, like I said, there's a reason we use cognac on our flagship. But Sauterne is fabulous. PX is really interesting. It really depends on your palate. What people prefer.
Now, separately from whiskey, you got 3 styles of rum, got multiple gins, and I got to ask is back on Good Acre in 2019, you and Sherry were asked this question, and she said you were mostly gin drinkers at the time, despite making whiskey. So has that changed in the 6 or 7 years since?
Well, I mean, for me, it's a little more seasonal. I tend to have more of a palate for whiskey in the wintertime, but we both love gin. So there's the three styles of gin that I make. The first one with Solvay, I was looking at place. Like I wanted something that reminded me of the way the prairie smelled after a rain in early June, and so that's what I chasing down with botanicals. And then with Gustav, I'm remembering I wanted a navy strength, and so it was going to be a big juniper gin. But I also wanted something that reminded me of there was years and years ago when I was over in Norway. I was in a boat in a fjord, and there was a waterfall coming off a cliff, and so it was coming through. It was a waterfall that was coming through the middle of a birch forest, and so it had a really distinctive, fresh character to it. And so I was trying to assimilate that. And then with Anna's Garden, I was looking strictly for something that was going to go well with tonic. And, I chased down botanicals there and then decided to use hibiscus. And I liked the way you know, I'd make it pink as a seasonal gin to be released at the same time as the rosé. And then it turned out we actually had a pretty solid cocktail gin with Anna's Garden as well. And because the response we would get from Solvay initially, and over the years from bartenders, is that its versatility is that you can take in all these different directions: vegetal, floral, citrus, and herbal, and make really solid cocktails with it. Man, a skilled bartender. And so I was going for a tonic at his garden, but then we started getting feedback from the bar. I don't know, this is a cocktail gin too. This is fun. So
And I got to ask this too, which maybe the product that I need the most explanation on of how you get there is the Islander Nordic style rum.
yeah.
As far as I know, not a lot of rum being made in the Nordics. So
Yeah, there's two places that name came from. One is I was in contact with a distiller in the Åland Islands, in between Sweden and Finland. It's an archipelago there in Mariehamn, and I was in email contact with a distiller there who was making rum from sugar beets. And we're in a valley full of sugar beets in the Red River. And so my original idea was that I wanted to make rum from sugar beet sugar, and Olander kind of sounded like Islander. I thought I was so clever at the time. But I ran into the TTB reg of, if you want to use the word rum, you have to make it from sugar cane. You can't use sugar beet sugar. And so I knew I still wanted to make it. I just had to source sugarcane sugar in order to do it. And the whole inspiration from it came from my last corporate job, having me in the Caribbean and Central America quite a bit. And I just really developed an appreciation for rum in general, but also the house spiced rums you would get to in small restaurants that were more local oriented. And it was really blew me away because college experience with Captain Morgan was all I could point to. And so I didn't know much about it, but here they would come with this bottle and all the spices were in it, and it was fantastic. And so it doesn't fit with our field of glass anything, but I was like, I really like rum, and I've got a distillery now, so screw it, I'm gonna make rum. And Minnesota on our big spiced rum per capita states. The only problem is that the Venn diagram between craft spirits drinkers and spiced rum drinkers there's not much overlap. But that said, I've seen some just tremendous cocktails made with it by very skilled bartenders and yeah. It's been fun to place it.
Eliza, I had to ask because again, not many Nordic the sugar
It's not
trade
really
didn't really get up there, but still. So I know we are a little over time now. So Mike, thank you so much for bearing with me. Hang on for a minute just after we finish recording. Quit just for a question or two. Make sure also, folks, I didn't even get a chance to ask about Minnesota's liquor laws. We don't have time for that one today, but it's worth checking out. I'll see if I can find a good resource on that. I know it's pretty tight. Yeah. But, thank you everyone for listening. You can find Far North Spirits through their website and check for your distribution in your state. If for some reason you can't get them directly, do keep an eye out for Lost Lantern, for one, at least, because you might have some single barrel. You'll be able to taste them in the farmers' fields. So keep an eye out for them. This is some fantastic rye. Can't recommend it enough. And Thank you everyone for listening. See y'all next week.